Well, hello folks, hello, and thank you very much for sticking around for this after-show discussion. I'd like to thank Andrew and everyone here at the Greenwich Theatre for letting us have this forum. We are the London Comedy Forum, and we are interested in matters to do with comedy and matters to do with research in comedy. And one of the things we were desperate to get involved with was pantomime, because we feel it's something that's under-researched and is not really talked about enough in the mainstream and in the academy. So it was brilliant that Andrew and Simon were able to arrange this event. Speaking tonight, we've got Simon Sladen here. Simon is researching into pantomime. He's also he runs the database for pantomime in the country, and he's editor of the Panto editor of the British Theatre Guide. Panto editor of the British Theatre Guide, and is also a curator at V&A, and part of his curation is into performance and panto. We've got, of course, the wonderful Andrew Pollard here, who many of you have just seen being fantastic in the show as the Dane and writer. And Andrew's been doing the panto here since 2005, is it, Andrew?
Yes, I think.
Yeah.
You might know more than me. This is year 8 I've been in, 9 I've written.
Yeah, so, and also much connected with Oldham.
I kind of started out at Oldham Coliseum. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Andrew. And finally, we've got Chris Abbott, who has written a book on the Salisbury Playhouse pantos during the kind of golden era, which was about 1965,
What? There's always more golden.
There's always one of the golden eras. He's researched people that have worked in that panto. I think what's interesting for our purposes is actually the Greenwich panto and those sort of, classic Salisbury pantos seem to share a lot of features in common, which hopefully we'll talk about. The plan is just, I've got a few questions, and then we're going to throw it open to you guys if you've got any questions for anybody, and we'll finish about 10:30, and there'll be plenty of time for another drink at the bar. So, so if I could start, actually, can I start with you, Simon, really? Your research into panto, I mean, how big is panto still in the 21st century?
So estimates suggest that about 33% of live performance in the UK is pantomime. That's professional live performance. So over this season, we've got 257 professional pantomimes listed on the National Database of Pantomime Performance. There are a few touring productions which haven't been listed on there. We've got over 2,000 names listed on the database, but that really is probably about 10 to 15% of everybody involved in the industry. So in terms of performers, it's often a performer's first job out of training, or sometimes in training, and there are interesting models there financially, so with some people in their final year before graduating, perhaps employed on a slightly different wage. But that it takes over theatres in that sense. The stage and what's on stage have been reporting very interesting figures that, there's not as many this year. Well, we have found that there are 257 at least. So the industry is as booming as ever, really, in that sense.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. Can I move to Andrew, particularly about when you are putting a pantomime together, writing it, casting it, and all the rest of it, what are the sort of essential ingredients that you feel a panto should have and must have?
Well, for kind of on a very personal level, it is a story first. You need a great story to hook everything on, because once you've got the story arc, then you can start to drop all the little things in, the music and the comedy. For me, it is the story. The story's got to be the kind of spine, and then I start to think about comedy routines. So try and get 2 fairly large comedy routines in each half, and my kind of little warm-up bit when I first come on. And then the music's a really important part, and Steve Mark Quick, who's the MD, he's been doing them as long as I have, and we tend to spend a lot of time working out that and looking at what we can do with the songs and how we can kind of do them in a slightly different way, or make them in a way like a musical, tell the story a little bit more. Sometimes it's quite bizarre. I mean, Live and Let Die, lyric-wise is a bit weird, but it kind of works, and it kind of tells the story of those two, of Puss and Sam. So, but it's always the story, and we spend a lot of time making sure the story's right and that it's played right. I always say there's a kind of football analogy where people know what you're playing, really. So if you're the hero, you're there playing at the front there, and you're pushing the story. Whereas somebody like me, I can kind of run in and out of it. So we're very careful. Although there was a lot of corpsing tonight, I know, but for the kind of central characters to tell that story, because kids, the kids want to believe in that story, and especially when we do the matinees and things, we do that, and slightly less ad-libbing and stuff in the matinees.
Do you when you've got predominantly a children's audience, I'm thinking, some of those sort of schools, matinees and things.
Yeah.
I mean, does it change a lot, or is it?
It doesn't change a lot, but it is a very different dynamic. I mean, it's a strange thing now. I mean, these 10 a.m. shows, we do lots of 10 a.m. and 1:30 shows, which are kind of fairly new, I think. I mean, it's I think in the rep system that's a kind of happened. A lot of the commercial pantos don't do 10 a.m. shows. The rep system started to do that, and so pantos aren't children's shows; they're family shows, and you've got to write with that in mind across the board, and you've got to put little bits in for everybody. So, but you do have to think about that a lot, because we do quite a few 10 a.m. 1:30 shows. So there's got to be enough slapstick and funny falling over and fart gags for kids, and shouting for kids to kind of latch onto. But I am very, careful that we put in something for everybody, really, because I think, and then there's nothing like it. There is nothing like seeing a family all laughing. Maybe together, maybe at different things, and that's the great joy of it, I think.
Thank you. Chris, on that note, really, about those sort of ingredients of Panto, what were some of the features of those Salisbury Pantos that people talked about when you interviewed them that made them so kind of special?
I think the things they had are things that, in many cases, we saw tonight as well, because what I saw tonight was very much in that tradition, I think. And, of course, it's therefore no surprise to me that Andrew Ney writes the Salisbury pantomime. So there's a neat link there. But it seems to me that what a good pantomime's about is, first of all, retelling a story that the audience kind of already know. I think you have to be with people and know how it's going to end. If it's completely new, that's very difficult. So I was really interested to see how people were going to approach Puss in Boots, because most of us haven't seen many pantos of Puss in Boots. Suddenly we've got 2 this year, but they're the only 2 in the UK, the 2 in London. So it's really interesting to see that. And I think what we saw tonight was a way of taking that really complex, incredibly amoral, unpantomime-like story, but making it work. And I think that telling a story where people are halfway ahead of you is part of it. The other bit is controlled chaos, and you have to have the controlled chaos, and that's a long British tradition going right back to the Mummers plays and Lord of Misrule and all the rest of it. And you have to have that business where a theatre's where you sit down, shut up, and the lights go out, but in a pantomime the lights come on, you stand up, you make a lot of noise. You upturn all the expectations. So I think that's essential as well.
Thanks, Chris. Can I just ask Simon, actually, which pantomimes, because as we're saying, Puss in Boots seems to be something that's not often, or not as often done. Which pantomimes tend to get done and which don't? And can you say some of the reasons why?
Yeah, so this year was the first year the National Database of Pantomime Performance existed. It's been 2 years in the making, and this year we found that Jack and the Beanstalk is the most popular pantomime. Now, some people, it has the most performances this year. Some people are saying it's because of the films that have been out, which possibly has influenced it. That's interesting because it hasn't had the Disney makeover. Often the Disney films, Cinderella, Snow White, Peter Pan, Aladdin, are all very well known and have influenced those presentations. Princess Jasmine as a character called Jasmine didn't exist before that, and with the magic carpet we suddenly see that effect coming to the fore. Pirates of the Caribbean, we've seen Robinson Crusoe's come back, and actually, we interviewed Andy and Susie McKenna, who both have done Puss in Boots this year, and Shrek, with the character of Puss coming back, seems to have been quite influential in decisions and convincing artistic directors and theatre managers that we can actually sell this show because people know the characters. Peter Pan has been around as a pantomime now for about 23 years. That's a long time. The first Snow Whites were in the 50s. What I find fascinating is that Dick Whittington isn't done as much these days. And the York Barbican's pantomime on the 7th of December was cancelled because of poor ticket sales. They found it very hard to market the show. At Camberley a few years back, they found that because it's a local council one, the servers were not sending the emails out because of the word Dick in the title. So that was a massive issue for their publicity department there. And also it's a story that perhaps not many people know. They may have heard of Dick Whittington. Interestingly, at the Millfield, you don't hear anything about the Lord Mayor of London until after the finale, so it's a sort of quest story. But Robin Hood is going up, and Robin Hood was done here last year, and he's writing it for Watford this year. But then we've had some big series of that. It has had the Disney story to it, and there's also a production of Little Mermaid this year. And next year, Kudos, which is the biggest pantomime company, are going to produce their second ever Beauty and the Beast, which is very interesting. I think they've done Little Mermaid once before, but they're doing that. So those Disney titles are very important, and I think also, is it in the public conscience in terms of the Puss in Boots now? And I actually think that looking towards Greenwich and Hackney, which probably along with York and Nottingham are pantomime powerhouses, I do think we might see other venues doing it. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if Salisbury would be more open at doing it now, having seen the success that you've had here. I don't know if you'd agree with that.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah.
Andrew, do you tend to choose what pantomime you're going to do in a sort of almost not in a Disney way, so that you say, well, if it's going to be a kind of traditional story-led panto, we'll on a scale like here, we're not going to go for the big Disney effects.
Well, I mean, you do want to go for the ones that are popular. There are kind of 5, the Jack the Beanstalk, Cinderella and things, and you'd be mad not to do that because people want to see them, and there's something in our kind of ingrained in us that we want those stories. They're just told time and time again. Cinderella, it's every love story film you've ever seen. So I think you've got to do those, and I want to do them. But it's quite nice here now. I always have to go to James, who runs the place, and say, please, can we do this? But I think we've got to the point now where the audience trust that we'll come up with something that they'll like, and they like us. So I've got a little bit more leeway. But like Simon said, I wouldn't have done Puss in Boots had Shrek not had Puss in Boots in it, because at least then kids know who that character is, even if they don't know the story. And this year Greenwich wanted to do Jack and the Beanstalk, and I just felt we were a year too early because we've done it before, and for me it just felt too near. So I asked to do Puss in Boots, and then realised that it's very like Jack and the Beanstalk. In the story the Peril story, there's an ogre which is very giant-like. So I decided that we wouldn't do that, and we'd have this goblin, and we'd kind of weave that. So we kind of changed it, which has worked for us. But and I think you're allowed to kind of change it a little bit. But yeah, you do have to think commercially as well, and which are the big hitters. Cinderella and Jack the Beanstalk are usually the big hitters. Snow White, which we can't do. I'd quite like to do it, but we can't get 7 dwarves here. We can't afford it. Although Kudos this year aren't doing dwarves. They're doing a thing they did in the musical of Shrek, where people are on their knees, which is quite interesting. And there was a bit of outcry about that, but so maybe we could look at doing that at some point. But yeah, there's always a commercial eye on stuff. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I wanted to ask Chris, and actually all of you really, something which is about the notion that for how important pantomime is for children, because it always makes me think that sometimes it's the very first theatre experience they have, and it's the only one where they can shout out and join in and everything. And then any other theatre experience after that, we say don't join in, be quiet, don't respond. how important do you think that is, the notion of...
I think it's as important as it's always been, and I think it still is the first experience of theatre for a great many children. What's changed, I think, and I think this is a shame, is that it's not always with their families. It's for a lot of kids now. It's as part of a school group, because certainly the pantomimes I wrote about in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there might have been groups of Cubs and Scouts and Guides and Brownies, but otherwise it was mostly family groups. Whereas now, I mean, I've been to London pantomime matinees where I feel like I'm the only adult apart from the teachers. You know, it's a very different experience to be part of. But the kids are still having that experience. And you're quite right that they probably don't go to much other theatre. You know, the next time they're probably studying for GCSEs and being hauled off to see Of Mice and Men and told to shut up. You know, that's probably the next experience. But in between that, with a bit of luck, if they're lucky, they're involved with Amdram or a school production, and they're actually doing pantomime or something similar themselves. And then they can still keep the magic going. Because I think the other thing that's really important is that kids discover pantomime when they're still young enough, and I think crucial age is around about 7 or 8, for it to be magic. Because that's when I discovered the Salisbury pantomimes, and you know, I thought the scenery there was just extravagant beyond belief. I've seen the photographs now, and it doesn't kind of match up. You know, I was just stunned when real ponies came onto that minute stage. It was an old theatre in a Methodist chapel. It's not the one that's there now, you know. But it seemed absolutely fantastic then, and the sheer terror when, and I still think it was a dragon, and I can't think what pantomime had a dragon in it that was fearsome, but that came down into the audience and frightened the life out of me. So I think you have to have those kind of peril experiences as well, and that changes your whole attitude towards live performance.
Andrew, on that note about how, you know, pantomime can be transformative in a way, for especially for children, because if you get the story right and you get the magic right, it's tremendously profound for them. Are you conscious, or when you're performing, are you conscious of that, or are you simply conscious of just telling the story? Or are you conscious that those magic moments have to be played?
Well, I think they do have to be played, and because, like Chris said, I mean, you know, that it was my first experience as well, was Panto, and I was absolutely transfixed. We didn't have a professional. Oldham was my nearest theatre, and occasionally I got taken to Oldham, but the ones I saw the most were Amdram pantos, but even so, they had such an effect. I mean, to the point where really I wanted to do Puss in Boots because it was one of the first ones I saw. And, you know, those things just stick in your brain and you want to recreate that somehow. And I think it is, you know, there will be kids in the audience who will be actors, you know, and it is that first experience. And there's something in Panto, because it's kind of over the top, and because there's so many effects, it does have a massive effect on you. You know, even pyros. I can see now. My first one was Humpty Dumpty, and I can see Humpty Dumpty falling off the wall in a flash, and you know, it just lives with you. And so I'm very conscious of that you know, it is important, and you know, you are part of a heritage, really, and I take that very seriously. I think it's a great thing. You know.
There is something magical. I mean, I can remember the Kenneth Moore Theatre watching Jack and the Beanstalk, and there's a scene in it where the dame has to part the cow, and she, you know, she sings the song, and I can remember being incredibly moved by that, and I was 45 at the time. You know? And it was only afterwards I thought, well, actually, that was a man in a wig singing to 2 other men inside out. Somehow that moment, you know.
Well, that's the power of theatre, isn't it? I mean, it really is. Yeah.
Simon, can I ask you, because I know a lot of your research is about performance in pantomime. I mean, is there a sense that, you know, some of the skills, the performance skills that people, you know, are brought to pantomime are kind of disappearing with the advent of, I don't know, you know, reality stars and so on coming into the...
So we, earlier this year, I conducted the first ever pantomime training survey where we looked at the industry today, routes into the industry, what's happening. So generally you get some specific routes in. People coming from other industries because of skills they have there, maybe a comic or a stand-up or a circus act, for example, coming in that way. People having trained and worked their way through in this sort of hierarchical structure. So sometimes, for example, they've started out, let's take York for an example, with Berwick Kaler. They'll have joined the chorus, have had a speaking role. Next year they'll go up, and then they'll progress up through the ranks. What we are sort of losing are some of those, what you might class as musical and variety skills, which are slightly different to stand-up in the use of direct address and the use of warmth and nature. And we saw today, and actually Andy's pantomimes are quite unique in the sense that you don't really have a comic as such in your show. So, usually have the sort of Buttons character or the Simple Simon who has a shout out to the audience, and you've integrated that with your sort of matriarchal figure.
Yeah.
So Paul Krytoff I think it's here somewhere. So he takes on some of that chorody, and you and him have that slapstick there. And what we're finding is in professional shows, the dame is getting less and less important because we don't have as many skilled trained performers. Now, whereas other theatrical forms have the rest of the year to practice, pantomime you've got one time of the year. Already that means that there are only, this year probably about 200 dame roles there. And there are people like Andy and people like Kenneth Allen Taylor, who's celebrating his 30th year of pantomime this year, in those roles for a long time, honing those performances. And what that means is that how do you make that jump? Often you start out as Ugly Sister and maybe go through that, or you play comic. But in those commercial productions, they will always cast a Joe Pasquale or a Brian Connolly because that can drive the narrative. And we see, as there have been a lot of press recently about the principal girls, 10%, principal boys, female principal boys, 10% this year, because we're merging roles. So the comic principal boy is now much more popular for those reasons. We're having many more female-led narratives in the top 5 produced, and Snow White and Sleeping Beauty both require a kiss to awaken her. So what we're seeing is that comedy aspect perhaps not as strong as it once was, arguably in the 80s, with a lot of variety performers, a lot of stand-up comics. But we are seeing a lot stronger principal boys and girls now, I think. And I think Greenwich is a real example of that. You have two, stunning principal boy and girl with amazing voices. That's something I think is a strong casting practice over the years. Those of you that have seen it, you'll see that's quite an integral part of the show. And that's come from musical theatre training, which is very, very good in the country, and people are coming through that way. What that does mean, and it surprises me, is that pantomime is not actually a part of many of these training institutes' syllabus, which is very, very odd when it does take over the theatres every year. And actually, as a result of the research, there are some more pantomime things popping up, and people going, oh yeah, wait a minute, why are we not addressing this? Why is there only, probably fewer than 5 departments that run a course on pantomime, university departments? Why is it not that an end-of-term production or a showcase is pantomime? We were at a conference in Glasgow where they have, at the conservatoire there, a module where it results in they do a pantomime for a week, and they learn those skills of what is it like performing 3 times a day, what is it like rehearsing in a very short period of time, because actually those are skills you need. And over the panto you're with people for a month, or if you're at the Hackney Empire, 3 months. That's a quarter of your year living together. Those are skills that you can't necessarily learn in training, but you will get through the repetition and the inheritance of traditions. Andy, you could say that is part of this lineage from Kenneth Allen Taylor, who was at Oldham and Nottingham. Eric Potts worked at Oldham. He now writes for First Family. Andy, you worked at Oldham and with Eric, didn't you, on some things? Yeah. And now people are being influenced by your productions here and that you're working with. Yeah. And you see this oral tradition passing down. And I think what's very interesting is that in London are 2, big pantomimes that are not commercial, Hackney and you hear, both have links back to Kenneth Allen Taylor, and now are spreading that out. So if we plot that, the network is actually quite tight, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
In terms of practitioners, and I would say that you are definitely a practitioner of pantomime, but there are probably quite few. I don't know if you would agree.
Yeah, in terms of the kind of the comedy stuff, I mean, it was when I was a kid. Kenneth Alan Taylor was at Oldham, now he does Nottingham, and so I was influenced by him undoubtedly. But also for me, it's also the people like Morecambe and Wise. And when I was a kid, I was a kid in the 70s. The black and white films of the Crazy Gang, of Old Mother Riley, was still Laurel and Hardy was still there. And I have to say, I take as much from that. I'm an actor. I'm not a comic. So it's a bizarre thing, and I think Kenneth Allen does this, and Eric does it as well, Eric Potts. We have to assume, in a way, a role. So I'm not a natural comic. I'm not a comedian. I don't have a personality. So I create a kind of personality for myself. And I think that's slightly from the rep system, actually, where, actors had to do whatever you were given. And so you get your armour. I mean, the costume of a dame is a great armour anyway. I always say, if you take the wig off and the boobs and you look at the face, it's a clown's face, basically. The makeup is clown, and that's how I take it. And the flat boots, I know I wear heels occasionally, but I wear boots most of the time, and that comes from seeing Les Dawson do pantomime, and I saw Arthur Askey do pantomime years ago, and those kind of just a bloke in a frock. I'm slightly camper sometimes, but I don't quite like the drag dame, which has become quite. But people love it, and if it works, it works. It's just not for me. But my influences are as much kind of old music hall. I mean, I always think it's great being here, where the great Max Wall, he's up on photographs here. His career was revived here, and I just think there's something fantastic in being on that stage, knowing those kind of people have done that, and you're in that tradition. But I'm not a comedian, but I try and sort of channel that, definitely. But there are kind of lineages, and it is interesting, this rep theatre thing, as opposed to being a comic. And you're right, it's funny now, there are very few big comedy names who do Dame now. It's mainly the Joe Pasquales and the Brian Conleys who play the idle Jack, or sometimes the hero, and put those roles together. The reason we don't really have a Silly Billy or a Simple Simon here is economics most of the time. This year there are 6 professionals. It's not many. Occasionally we have 7. And so something has to give, really, and so that's why me and Paul have kind of taken on more of that comedy role. Sometimes, if it's Jack of the Beanstalk, Jack will have a dual role. Alim, who brilliantly plays Puss, who's over there, he's got that kind of slightly dual role this year. And so economics has a say in that as well. Yeah.
Can I ask Chris something?
Can I just say, following on from that about lineages, because writing about rep panto in the 50s, 60s and 70s, I thought that had kind of come out of nowhere after the war, when the rep movement really took off. But the key people in that were Henry Marshall and his brother Oliver Gordon. Oliver Gordon played Dame and was director and so on. And I knew he was much older and had worked in commercial panto as well, at the Alex Birmingham and the Theatre Royal Windsor. When I dug further, I discovered he ran the Theatre Royal Windsor during the war, and just before the war, they wanted to do one last Harlequinade, as was done in Edwardian and Victorian times. So they found an elderly Harlequinade performer, dragged him out of retirement in his 60s, and got him to teach a whole Harlequinade routine with jumping through trapdoors and so on to these young actors, including Oliver Gordon, who played a very small part in it. And throughout the 60s and 70s, he reproduced those scenes and exactly gave the stage carpenter instructions of how each door should open in the haunted bedroom or the laundry or whatever it was. And you can trace it right back. And if you go back, I then tried to find where that Harlequinade performer came from, and I found he came from a family lineage of Harlequinade performers, even with the same name. He's Harry Ewins. He had an uncle called Harry Ewins, who sadly gave up Harlequinade at a very young age because, don't want to bring the tone down, but his wife was playing Queen Rat one night and staggered into the wings and died on Boxing Day night because she'd been laced into her costume too tightly. So people died for pantomime in those days.
With the Star Trap, was banned.
Well, the Star Trap was banned.
Yeah. Very dangerous. Always putting that technology at the beginning. I think what's interesting as well with that, Chris, is that these comic set routines, which Greenwich does, and Andy, as you said, does too, are not done as much. There's part of the industry that says, we can't afford to do slosh every day, it's very expensive, we have to dry clean the costumes, and we haven't got time to strike it on set. But then another argument is actually, where are we getting? How do we know what to do, and where is that passing down of traditions going? You know, I'm sure that Andy, you receive emails. You know, we get emails from people saying we want to do, for example, the Tree of Truth. But we don't know what it is, and where are we going to get that from? Well, when they were, you know, yes, Chris's book, plug. Do you want to hold it up, Chris? There's a flyer on the table. You know, gag books, and actually professionally now, why would you publish that? Because that's your bread and butter. And often it's like when comics suddenly went on TV and their act was gone. But I think those set pieces we don't see as often, because actually they're very skilled and they take great timing. Look at your boxing one this year. They're very difficult to think of something new and inventive, which you manage to do every year here. And they take a lot of time to rehearse, and you don't necessarily have all that time, do you?
And equally as well, I mean, like you say, I mean, you know, things like the trick sets, all that kind of stuff is almost a lost art now.
Yeah,
I'd love to do something like that, but I don't know. I don't know who to go to. Yeah. And I'd love to revive things like that. And here we do have a problem. It's a very small team. I'd love to do a great big slapstick routine. We just can't do it. We haven't got the people backstage to clear it up. Yeah. And because it's a weird stage here, the revolve works the best for us. There's no flying. So we can't do lots of mess because it'll get into the revolve, and that'll, you know, so there's real kind of practical elements. It's a real shame. But I try and do something in that vein, and try and have a little bit of try and do slapstick without slapstick sometimes. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You know, but at least I do try and do something a little bit new every year. Try and kind of, for me, but it is that thing of, you know, we have 2 weeks to rehearse. That's why usually me and Paul take the brunt of that, because we know each other. But I'd love to do a comic set with things falling out on doors and all that, but we don't have the skills. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I think it's time to throw questions to the floor. Does anybody have a question that they would like to ask anybody about Panto, about the Panto here, or anything like that? Yes, thank you.
An international crowd who just do not get the British fascination with Panto. And I just wonder, what other countries in the world support pantomime greatly?
So, pantomime, there is pockets around the world. So Singapore, there's a pantomime tradition there. Wild Rice Theatre Company have been doing that for over a decade now. So this year they're doing Jack and the Bean Sprout. Very particular for them. In South Africa, at the Joburg Theatre Complex, the Nelson Mandela Theatre, Janice Honeyman has been doing pantomime there for over a quarter of a century. That's a very big production. They have the National Ballet of South Africa in their shows, probably bigger than any show here. You know, massive cast. Used to be supported in terms of costumes and set by Kudos in this country, because of course, where do you get your scenery from if there isn't an industry in your country? This year, America is seeing more and more pantomimes on the up. So the Lithgows, Bonnie Lithgow, Nigel Lithgow that we know, 3 years ago started with a partnership with a theatre over there. This year they've launched Panto at Pasadena Playhouse, which is a 10-year contract. Interestingly, they're choosing to do Aladdin, Cinderella, Peter Pan and Snow White, and they don't call them that, so they call it a Cinderella Christmas, a Snow White Christmas, Aladdin and his Winter Wish. Only Aladdin has had a dame so far, so that's one of the interesting points. You know, what do they get? And the guy playing the dame played Edna Turnblad in Hairspray, so people know him through that. There are pockets, Piccolo Theatre, that do a pantomime each year. They special in Harlequinade type theatre and commedia, so that's where their route is. And then there are tiny pockets where there's expats. So there are some places in Australia, for example, and interestingly, the Lithgow production of Aladdin next year will transfer to Australia for the summer season. So they'll be doing a summer panto. And Kudos, if any of you have seen their production of Aladdin with a 3D genie, toured China, not as a pantomime, but obviously it was very similar to a pantomime. What I think is very interesting in the last few years is that pantomime has become a British export product. It's very lucrative in America, and if you watch some of the promo videos, just as if we had Wyon Coolit shadow puppetry here, for example, at Festival Hall, there'd be a lot about the history and traditions of that. In America, that's what they're doing. This is what British people do at Christmas. This is what British people do. You can participate in that exotic form, just as we might go and see, whatever, Peking opera, or absolutely. So I think that is something that we don't really champion pantomime as much as perhaps we should over here, and celebrate as much as it's British, which is why we've just celebrated the 3rd annual Panto Day, which has been great. And I think we do need to start looking at it more as, well, what is it that makes it British? Because actually, it's Christmassy, but it's not really, because originally it opened Boxing Day and ran all the year round. Okay, we can look at school holiday periods and people taking time off and stuff, but there's something very British in the Dame, I always think. You know, that lineage of medieval mystery plays, and Mrs. Noah, Mac the Sheep Stealer's Wife, the nurse in Romeo and Juliet, of course, would have originally been played by a man. And those British stories, Dick Whittington, Jack and the Beanstalk, Robin Hood. But also, our Victorian actor-managers were very savvy. They knew, you know, how to get that term we all use, bums on seats. They knew what would sell, spectacle stars, musical stars, and I think they really perfected that route. And that was a time when D'Oyly Carte were also perfecting that touring route, how to orchestrate a production that could then be used elsewhere, or, you know, just as the Palladium pantomimes went around, so did Victorian pantomimes get used year after year. I think we really saw commercialism concreting and crystallising in that period, and I don't think the commercialism of pantomime is anything new at all. I think that's as an integral part of it here. And actually, you know, I applaud Andy, because if you go and see one of his scripts elsewhere, it's completely different. Whereas a lot of places will use the same script year after year after year. So there's a recycling process that goes on, which helps and also controls those stories. Why do we always do those top 5? Well, it's because we've got the set, we've got the script, and that comes back to the finances again, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is something as well still in that. We just love those stories, you know, that they are ingrained. I think there's something, you know, you can't really qualify what it is, but we do like to be told those stories. But interestingly, you say, you know, the ones I write are always different for different theatres, and it's true. One, because I'd feel bad to just give somebody an old script. I want to kind of make sure that it, you know, there's a difference. But also, that's the interesting thing as well with rep pantos, like I'll write for Watford Palace as well. The aesthetic is always different. The audience is different. Sometimes I have trouble with that, because I'll see one of them and think, that's not Panto for me, but it is for that theatre, and I have to write for that. So at Salisbury, for instance, it's newly written music, so there are no pop songs, nothing like that. It's like a musical, so that has a different aesthetic as well. And it's slightly gentler than here. I think they'd be horrified here.
It's very fruity here.
It is quite fruity here. I mean, not too fruity. I do try and keep a lid on it. But in Salisbury, it is very kind of tame, for want of a better word. Watford slightly as well, actually, although it didn't used to be with Roy Hood scripts. But Bridget, the artistic director,
they shouted Viagra to draw the bridge up at Watford, didn't they? So that's how fruity they were there.
But you're right. I mean, it is. You know, tomorrow there's an American theatre company coming to see the show, and I'm going to chat to them, and they want to put on a pantomime. So you know, the message is getting over there.
I do think the Lithgows have played a massive role there, because they've had now what's his name, Neil Patrick Harrison in as the Magic Man in the Magic Mirror. They've had Ariana Grande, so they're just applying those conventions that we always use here. But Americans have never seen that. You know, the opportunity to get close to these MTV stars, these, you know, stars that they've seen in their local theatre. That's something very, very different, tied into that nature of Christmas and the children being able to perform in the show. And I think
we don't have that tradition of answering back to the audience or getting involved at all. It's very much, even if you're this high, you're going to see.
You go and you sit.
Yeah.
And you keep your mouth shut.
Yeah. So there's a bigger warm-up process in their shows. And what's also interesting is that, for example, Royal Mail ran a stamp campaign, didn't they, with pantomime, and Sainsbury's last year had that. So that shows how ingrained it is. It's a point of reference that everybody can understand.
Yeah.
And those "oh no it is" and "oh yes it is" are ingrained into our DNA. I think, Chris, it was you who said to me that it's a bit like when you go to church. Nobody ever sits you down and says, now, when this happens, you have to do this. But you sort of just know it, and you get it through everybody else.
Now we know why Andy's got an American gentleman who's planning to make this happen in
That was
America.
very interesting. I mean, purely that was, you know, we I shouldn't say this, but we had somebody else who then had to drop out because they had other commitments. So this just came from the audition process, and Luke, by far and away, was the best person, and he had that ability to. He didn't kind of take the mickey out of it, which some English performers do, actually. They're kind of like, oh, it's Panto. And Luke played it quite straight, which I thought was really good. And then I wrote it around him. But we were worried at first whether there'd be a bit of a backlash that we've got on American. I know commercial pantos do. Henry Winkler's playing Peter Pan, you know, at the moment. But we haven't really had that here. And I did kind of worry, but it seems to have gone down all right. But well, that's what I always do. I mean, I just write it around them, you know, so you can then play off it, you know. But it was a bit of a, is this going to be all right?
So part of the reason I wanted to come to this is because there was a recent kerfluffle about the death of Panto, and the things that were quoted were less productions, which seems to be mathematically proven untrue, less dames, and less pants rolls.
Yeah.
So I am curious if you guys think the reduction in pants rolls spells the death of pantomime. What is it about? What does it mean?
Well, I'll go quickly and then I'll pass on. No, I don't think it is. I mean, the thing is, Panto has always changed. And for a generation, it's, this isn't Panto. Panto used to be like this. And, by its very nature, it changes. It always takes on the latest technology. It's got its eye on the commercial, a commercial eye on stuff. So I think it does change. But I don't think it's the death at all. No, I think it just changes, and there are some positives to having boys playing boys, because you can tell the love story in a much stronger way. When it's a girl, you can't quite do the same thing. So I just think it just changing. I don't think there's a difference.
And I mean, Simon, I'm sure will know the numbers, but male principal boys, there's nothing new about that. I mean, Norman Wisdom in the 50s famously was the first one in modern times, but it happened before then. At Salisbury, Chris Harris, I remember the shock in the local newspaper in '65 when Chris Harris played Principal Boy. Now he's one of the country's best-known dames, Bristol and Bath. People are pantomime performers who go in and out of different roles, and I think Principal Boys, it works both ways for me, depending on the performer.
Absolutely. I think this has been what my life has been for the last 2 weeks about. So, the interpretation of that 10% which the database has had, obviously that doesn't take into account the amount of people seeing those shows. So some of those shows, let's say Norwich Theatre Royal, where they have a female Dandini, is going to be seen by thousands and thousands of people. So if we look at actual amount of people who will be exposed to a female Principal Boy, it's probably quite a lot. I mean, there have also been some debates that children don't find cross-dressing, they just don't understand it. Well, they just have to switch on CBeebies and see Justin Fletcher and Gigglebiz doing Nanny Knickerbocker, and, there's a pantomime dame that they get, and CBeebies do a panto every year where they do that. And you just look at where our comedy is today. So Mrs. Brown Boys, incredibly popular. Let's look at Little Britain, incredibly popular with the two ladies. I can't remember what the characters are called now, but they go skipping down and have their catchphrases. So I think that's a ridiculous thing to say. What I do think is one thing that hasn't really come out is the fact that the pantomime is the only theatrical form that's kept that historic notion of the Victorian breeches role. So it wasn't just pantomime that did it. In straight plays, in opera, in ballet. We don't do that in any of those anymore, yet nobody every year goes, isn't it a shame that some buxom beauty isn't getting her legs out? And of course, we have that little flash of leg, if you want to call it that, in other places. So Pamela Anderson as the genie is showing far much more than the Vesta Tilly ever did, because with society evolving and changing, as Andy has said, with page 3 everything is on the plate, so to speak. So we don't have to, you just have to look at advertising today to see that actually society isn't as prudish, and actually no one needs to do the wink wink nudge nudge anymore. So the dancers' costumes over the last 20 years have got more revealing, both male and female dancers. In Dick Whittington, the Sultana or the exotic beauties, or in Aladdin, in Abanazar's Lair, the Slave of the Ring is another opportunity for that. And what you do see, interestingly, is that male principal boys often have very tight trousers today. And still, as we've seen today, slap their thigh in a sort of acknowledgement of that past. So I think those conventions that the Victorian pantomimes had and the reasons for that cross-dressing are still there.
Yeah.
It's just that we're not seeing that in. And actually, we should also say that Victorian principal boys that were played by women were often really buxom.
Yes.
They weren't the Sveltest beauties that we all have in this
That's right.
romantic ideal.
James Agate, the theatre critic, said that a good principal boy should look as if she dines on stout and tripe and onions. So that was their ideal.
Yeah.
I think this is brilliant. I think there'll be an occasion after informal for a last question, but I'm conscious of time, so I just wanted to really wind it up and ask each of the panelists what their favourite pantomime joke or routine is.
Not a joke. Not a joke.
I actually had tonight, my favourite I had tonight was, it's a new one I've just had, was maybe you could lay on a chicken. No, I've given up doing that.
Well, you know, I'll own up to this. That is from Julian and Sandy. So that's I got that from Julian and Sandy, who written by Barry Took and Marty Feldman, the brother to Fenella Fielding, who voiced our cat.
Yeah,
but
that was a homage.
Yes, it was an homage. Yeah.
I'm not sure it's funny, but for me, one of the things that pantomime has to be is surrealist. And I can remember in the early 60s, a big commercial pantomime, it was Aladdin, and so it ended with a really good, elaborate transformation scene done by, and there won't be many people here old enough to remember Curry's Waltzing Waters, but one of their most elaborate waterfalls was actually a Highland scene. So this is Aladdin. The cave at the end of Act 1 suddenly transformed to a waterfall with heather each side, because that was what was on the stock scenery. And as Aladdin was changing into the more elaborate costume, on walked the Dagenham Girl Pipers. So, for me, that summed up commercial pantomime.
I mean, I don't know if I've got a favourite routine, but I mean, again, it's this thing when you're a kid, and I saw it was an amateur panto actually, but the kind of robust baking scene, and there was a guy who used to be kind of a local sort of celebrity, but he was an amateur, and he did a baking scene once where he took out his teeth. Actually took out his teeth to crimp the pastry of the pie and put them back in, and that just stayed with me. You know, and I think that was just classic. You know, you could get that.
Can I just say one thing? That I've been asked teeth brought up. That I've been asked to send huge, big love to you from the late big Dick Emery's son Nick.
Oh.
Because I know you even mentioned it.
Oh no, a big Dick Emery fan, yeah.
Teeth just now.
Yeah.
And he sent much love and all best wishes for the rest of the run.
Oh, thank you.
And I know you're a big fan.
I have. I've actually got what I call Dick Emery teeth. I did a play, and I've got some. I had them made at a dentist. Those used to do the vicar. He used to have the vicar teeth. I've actually got what I always call Dick Emery teeth. So I'll send him
And
one.
the last big London production of Puss in Boots '62 was Dick Emery.
Yes, I'm reading about that. Yeah,
Absolutely. I think for me it's one thing that I haven't ever seen live, and I would love to see it live, which is it's called the Ice Cream Song, and it employs the rule of three, and it's that whole thing. If you've got some ice cream, give it to me, and of course each time the person gets it in the face. But I've never seen it done. Maybe it's because they don't want to change the costume each time, but it is very, very funny. Clive Webb and Danny Adams do a version of it with 2, but I'd love to see it with 3. One of my earliest memories was seeing at the Wilkie Theatre Danny LaRue in Aladdin, and they had a front cloth which from floor to top was washing machines, and through it the acromaniacs jumped through that. So that's one of the pieces of spectacle. I don't think we'd see that again, but yeah, that's one of my, going back to that spectacle and chaos. You never knew which one they were going to come out of.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So you know where to get Chris's book from him. You know where to buy a bike if you need a bike. And, it just remains for me to thank Andy, to thank the panel, and thank Greenwich Theatre for letting us have this. Thank you very much.